Hello and welcome back to the Alexis Brooks Nutrition channel where we talk all things hormones, periods, gut, all that good stuff. So today, what we're going to be talking about are 3 secrets to a painless period. So by this point, if you've been following along, we have talked about how to have easy periods or how to navigate those annoying symptoms of PMS, like the bloating, the fatigue, the heavy periods, well, that's not PMS, but also heavy periods. And we've also talked about how to balance your blood sugars and why that's important for having balanced hormones, why it's important in terms of having a good, easy, healthy, manageable period, all that good stuff. But today we're going to focus more on the pain aspect of symptoms that we may experience with our periods. And this actually, the things that we're going to go over today are not just going to only apply to having cramps and pain while you're bleeding during your period, but it can also help out if you are someone that experiences pelvic pain on your period, or you have chronic pelvic pain, if you have pain just like in general. These are some things that can help you to improve that symptom too. So we are talking a lot about inflammation, and we'll talk about what causes it and how we can help it, and some other things that maybe you didn't necessarily think about that are linked to inflammation and linked to pain. So let's get into it. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about are foods. We'll talk about foods that are inflammatory or that can be inflammatory, foods that we want to avoid or limit. And I like to think of it when it comes to food, I like to have a holistic approach where overall in general, I like to think of all foods fits model. But of course, I do realize that there are certain foods that maybe don't make us feel good. And so those foods we either eliminate or we avoid, or we just limit how often we have it or the amount. Sometimes these foods can be dose dependent. So depending on like how much of that food, that's when we could really have the symptom, and otherwise we might be okay with it. So I like to think of it that way because I think that it's really important that we also have a healthy relationship with food. And when we begin to label foods as good or bad, they can actually impact our relationship with food, and it can cause us to feel guilty or feel shameful when we're eating certain foods that maybe fit in the bad list. And then it can also make us feel like we're a better person because we're eating good foods, which food, there is no moral attached to food. We could be good people and eat foods that are maybe less healthy. And so we don't want to necessarily make those attachments to food. So I just want to throw that out there before we start talking about some specific foods. All right, so the first thing, I'm going to break it up into categories. So the first category we'll talk about are foods that generally are inflammatory for like across the board for most people. And then we're going to also talk about some foods that are maybe not inflammatory for everybody, but can be inflammatory for a lot of people. Foods that are commonly inflammatory, but maybe not for everybody. So I'll first start off with the ones that are commonly, or sorry, the foods that are inflammatory like across the board that are probably going to affect like everybody. Number one on that list is going to be sugar. Having a diet that is really high in sugar promotes inflammation. And specifically, when I think about sugar, I think about it as that becomes more of a problem is really those added sugars. So we're not necessarily thinking about natural sugars like sugar that comes from fruit, for example, but more so those added sugars, and particularly refined sugars, so the really processed sugars. So um, high fructose corn syrup for sure is a big one, and that can be found in a lot of foods, particularly processed foods. Even like the white sugar or like brown sugar, those are considered processed sugars as well. So we want to be really mindful and careful about how much we're adding. Even like syrups, like say for example, you are going to your favorite coffee shop and you're getting a flavored drink. Usually it's going to be flavored with the syrup, and that would be considered more of a refined and processed sugar too. It is all these sugars that I listed off, these are sugars that are not bound. So they're just kind of freely moving about. I guess you could put it as they're not bound to any kind of fiber or protein or fat or anything like that. So as we're thinking about those sugars and whether they're bound or unbound, consider this. When it comes to fruits, that is a bound sugar, meaning that it is actually attached to a fiber. It has, so that's going to help out with blood sugar right away. So that's why these aren't necessarily ones that we have to be super careful about. Yes, they do still have sugar in them, or they do have sugar and they break down in our bodies as sugar. So it is important to balance your fruit intake, for example, with some sort of fat or protein. And so it is possible for these to raise your blood sugar as well, especially if you're eating like large portions of them, but not as significant as an impact as a super sweet latte or a sugary cereal or a sugary yogurt, for example, would have on your blood sugar. So that is something to keep in mind. All right, so what I would recommend you do is take inventory on the foods that you eat and see if they have added sugars, and if they do, how much. So this can mean you're going back looking at your looking at some nutrition facts or nutrition labels for some of the foods that you eat to see exactly what is going on, what is in there, and how much is it actually impacting you in your inflammation. Is that one of a big area that you have not yet focused on? Okay, so that's the first one. The next one we're going to talk about is your fat. So is your fat inflammatory? The fat that you're consuming inflammatory. So if you're consuming foods that have trans fats in them, that is a definitely inflammatory fat. And also thinking about the oils. So you probably hear a lot online about like seed oils or vegetable oils. Are they okay? Are they not okay? They are inflammatory. They are considered to have, they're polyunsaturated fats. We have different types of fats. We have saturated, we have unsaturated. Saturated comes from animal products generally. Um, Coconut oil would fit into, it is a saturated fat. But for the most part, our plant sources or non-animal sources of fats are are unsaturated. So these particular ones, they're omega-3, omega-6s, actually. So polyunsaturated and they're omega-6. Omega-6 is a pro-inflammatory type of fat, as opposed to omega-3, which is an anti-inflammatory fat. So when we're talking about the omega-3s, omega-6s, we want to make sure that we have the proper balance and ratio of them. Um, the average American diet has a ratio of omega-6s to omega-3, 20 to 1, something like that. But the recommendation is for it to be closer to 4 to 1 or 2 to 1, something like that. Somewhere in that neighborhood. So generally speaking, we're pretty far off. We're consuming way too much omega-6. Um, that said, we still do need omega-6. It is still helpful. It actually plays a role in terms of contraction, like helping out with muscle contraction. So this is part of what helps us to have our periods. It helps us to be able to shed the lining of our uterus. It gives it the movement for the uterus to be able to shed the lining. So that is a good thing. We do want to be able to release the lining on a regular basis. But when we have omega-6s that are too high in the diet, that becomes more of like contractions, and that's where the cramps can come in. Okay, so that's why we want to be careful about using those types of oils, whether cooking with it or even products that we see that have those as ingredients. So like soybean oil, canola oil, vegetable oil. Um, I'm forgetting the one I've been seeing a lot lately. I think it's bran oil I've been seeing. I don't know if I just mentioned corn oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil. So those are some examples of oils that are high in omega-6. So again, doesn't mean that our diet has to be zero. We don't have to like have no omega-6 in our diet at all, but we do want to make sure we're getting enough omega-3 to help that ratio, and also in general, just limiting the amount. So that's the fat piece of the inflammatory picture. Okay, so we talked about fats, we talked about sugar, processed foods. In general, processed foods, ultra processed foods, should I say, are inflammatory. So we could probably think about a lot of what those could be. Fast foods, in general, can be really inflammatory. Convenience foods, so a lot of like ready-made meals, for example, in the frozen section. Um, What else? Like snacks, a lot of snacks, like convenience items that we may purchase can be inflammatory. So what I want to mention too, it doesn't mean that any frozen food is not great or there aren't better choices to make when we're eating out or all snacks are bad. It's not that. It's just important, I would say overall, to pay attention to the ingredients and pay attention to like really reading that nutrition label when it's available to you because it gives us a lot of insight on what is inside the food. But the more we're choosing foods that are whole foods, foods that are fresh when possible, that the we can really cut back on a lot of that too. So that is a way to help out there. Okay, so I mentioned those. What else do I want to mention with you guys? Oh yeah, so the foods that are these category, the one I just went over, are the foods that can actually affect pretty much everybody. Pretty inflammatory for across the board. But now I wanted to share a couple of foods that are um, may or may not be inflammatory for you, depends on the person. So one is dairy. Um, Dairy is not necessarily inflammatory for everybody, but some people do find that dairy is inflammatory. So you have to decide on whether that is for you. If you're not really sure, you can kind of do a trial. You can see what things are like when you're having dairy and what it's not like when we don't have dairy. And some things to consider for this is not just your digestion. So that could be a really obvious one for some people. Maybe they get stomach ache, maybe they have diarrhea, maybe they have constipation. But so yes, pay attention to digestion, but also pay attention to energy levels, pay attention to mood, pay attention to your sleep, pay attention to your skin. Are you breaking out? Is there a change in your skin? Pay attention to pain with your menstrual cycle. So when you're bleeding, but then also outside of it, headaches, like all the things, like pay attention to your body as a whole in order to truly see if that is something that's bothering you or not. Sometimes we might just focus on one particular marker and not the other markers, and we can miss that something does bother us, that we're sensitive or maybe intolerant to it. Okay, and in general, anything that does that is that that you eat that you do not feel well with, it is causing inflammation. So keeping that in mind. And I know that can get challenging when there are foods that we just love, we don't want to get rid of, but it makes us feel like really sick after, but it is causing some inflammation too, because it's gonna elicit an immune response from your immune system. And one of the jobs of the immune system is to create inflammation, to be able to clear the invader out. So that is something to keep in mind. Um, Gluten is the other one. So the other food that not necessarily everyone needs to avoid, but some people do find that it makes a really big difference is gluten. So you may or may not be sensitive to it. You may not have an intolerance to it, but it can be inflammatory for a lot of people. Again, I would use the same thing that I mentioned for dairy is to trial it. See if what happens when you remove it for a week, 30 days. What happens? Do you notice a difference? Um, and if you add it back in, do you notice a difference then too? So you can always experiment to see if these are some things that bother you. Okay, so those are the five foods to avoid, limit, that are inflammatory or can potentially be inflammatory. Okay, so the next thing I want to go over with you are things that we can do, habits that we can have that are anti-inflammatory. So one thing we want to do is to stop the bleeding, and I don't necessarily mean period. Maybe this is a bad analogy, but we think about like a wound, for example. Like the first thing you want to do is just like stop it from bleeding out, and then we can figure out the other stuff on the back end. So the first part of like removing the inflammation and the inflammatory triggers, that's like one of the first parts, and then now we want to be able to rebuild and promote more anti-inflammatory properties and processes in the body. Okay, so and food-wise is of course adding anti-inflammatory foods. So I'll start off with omega-3s because we were just having that conversation about omega-6 and omega-3. So having foods that are high in omega-3s. We know it's found in fatty fish in high amounts. So that would be like salmon, mackerel. We could have tuna, sardines. Those are some inflammatory foods. If we're doing more of like plant-based, we want some plant-based options. Walnuts, flax seeds, make sure that they're ground so that you can have at optimal absorption of them. And there's also algae. So there's also algae we can have. Um, and specifically, there's also like you can get that in like a capsule form if you are not necessarily having those foods and you don't like seafood or whatever the thing is. You can have algae. You can also have omega-3 in a capsule form too. So there's other ways to have it. I generally recommend a foods first approach if it's possible, but just to have some alternatives that's an option too is having it in a supplement form. Um, Other thing, turmeric and ginger. So ginger is a powerhouse when it comes to inflammation, and it's actually been studied pretty extensively, and it's been shown to be just as effective as NSAID, so just as effective as like a pain killer, for example. So have your ginger, have it in, you can make it teas out of it, you can add it to foods that you're cooking. You can that actually comes in a supplement form too. Again, I do recommend to actually eat it because I find it delicious, but you have options there, but you can use it in so many ways. Have your ginger, about like an inch of ginger or so will be good. Turmeric is another one. Um, Again, adding to your food when you're cooking. There's also something called golden milk. I think it's become more popular. So you may have heard that before, but basically it'd be turmeric. You're having some sort of like coconut milk. You want to make sure that there's some sort of fat in there. So you can do like coconut milk, add black pepper, which helps to activate the turmeric. And you can add some additional things like for taste, maybe you want to have a little bit of like cinnamon, or maybe you want to add a little bit of honey, um, or maple syrup, something like that, to just give a little bit of a sweetness. You don't need a whole lot, but it could be a pretty tasty drink, and really warming and uh, like comforting, especially when you're on your period too. Golden milk on your period is good. Okay, so turmeric, ginger, omega-3s, berries. Eat your berries, blackberries, blueberries, raspberries, really high in antioxidants, also pomegranates. In general, think about foods that are really deeply pigmented. So like the dark colored fruits and veggies will have a lot of antioxidants, and colors are the color of the fruit or vegetable is related to the antioxidant that is within it. So having a variety of different colors will also ensure that you are getting a variety of antioxidants too. Okay, so let me make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Oh, hydration. That's the next thing in terms of like anti-inflammatory habits is drinking enough water. When you're dehydrated, it actually worsens inflammation. So yeah, and actually, I should put it this way: hydration is not just drinking water. It can be drinking water, and that's part of it. But it can also be drinking other beverages that could be hydrating. So like coconut water, for example. It could be having maybe like flavored water, like a flavored water with no added sugar. That could be another one. Having teas, a variety of teas can be great too. There are minerals within teas as well, so you can get some hydration that way. When we think about hydration, we do want to make sure that we're having some sort of mineral, because that's what helps the water to stay in, and get to the cells and where it needs to go. So having sure you're also having like potassium, magnesium, sodium, those are our electrolytes to be able to remain properly hydrated. There are drops that you can have that are like mineral drops to get that. You can also add a pinch of salt to your water, maybe like 2 cups of water or something like that. Doesn't have to be every glass of water that you have. Coconut water will already have electrolytes in there too. So bottom line, you just want to make sure that you remain hydrated in order to in order to have the anti-inflammatory properties and benefits. The next one would be to move. So move your body and move your body regularly. Um, that is key. We when we're sitting down, especially if we're living like a really sedentary lifestyle, we're sitting often, we're driving often, we have maybe a job where we're at a desk. We could get really stagnant. The blood flow and the circulation can get really stagnant, especially within the pelvis. The pelvis becomes collapsed when we're sitting for so long, or if we're like hunched over, that sort of thing. So standing as much as you can, and just in general getting movement, stretching, taking walks. This can also help out with the pain with like during your period. So even though like when we're in pain, we just don't really want to do anything. We just want to lay down. Doing some gentle movement can be really helpful to help to alleviate the period pain. And then the last thing I would say is to eat mindfully. So I know we can be really, really super busy, but if you're able to slow down when you eat, that makes a really profound impact on your digestion and your gut health, which is linked to inflammation too. So ideally, we would take 20 minutes to eat. If you're someone that normally takes 5 minutes to eat, maybe you shoot for 10 minutes. And focus on, despite the time that you take to eat your meal, focus on relaxing, because our body is not able to relax when we are distracted and doing a bunch of things. If we're working at the same time, if we're watching TV at the same time, we're texting, if we're like amped up, we're not going to be able to digest. So we have to get our bodies to a place where we can rest and digest. And what can help with this is to simply breathe before you eat. Before you take your first bite, can you take some deep breaths for 60 seconds before you take your first bite? That could be helpful for um, digestion, for gut health, and for reducing inflammation. All right, so um, the next category that we'll talk about is this is more lifestyle stuff. I know I've been talking a lot about food, but this is more lifestyle. So how stress and sleep can impact your periods. So first of all, we'll talk about stress. Stress is definitely inflammatory, and it promotes cortisol increase, which goes back to the whole blood sugar picture too. So we really don't want cortisol to be elevated all the time, and elevated in general. We need it in certain amounts. It's a very helpful hormone. Um, you can ask somebody who has very low cortisol. It's not fun either, but we want to make sure that we keep it um, balanced. Really, that's the key for all of this, is we want to keep it balanced. And so yes, we can have a lot of stress in our lives, whether it come from emotional stress, whether it be a physical stressor, whether it be environmental stressors. We can have a lot of stressors. So we want to focus on more so, how do we release these things? So they still may come, but how can we release them and not allow our bodies to take on these stressors so we're not carrying it with us? So there's a lot of things we could do. There are relaxation techniques that we can do, journaling, having a journaling practice in general. Maybe you are focusing on gratitude, so maybe you think about two or three things every day that helps that you're grateful for. So maybe it's something you do the beginning of the day or the end of the day. Again, the breathing piece is really helpful for reducing our stress. Um, because our body follows suit with our breath. So if we are beginning to slow down our breathing, it will also slow down our heart rate. It will begin to relax our bodies too. But the moment that our breathing gets shallow, that's when our heart beats faster, and then we can feel more anxious and that sort of thing. So by slowing down your breath, you can that is one way that you can do it. And I love that because we always have our breath with us. So you can do it whether you are stressed and you're driving in traffic, whether you are in a conflict with someone, whether you are at work or wherever you are, you have your breath. So that's a tool that we can always lean back on. Meditation, whether it's a practice that you adopt, or even like there's apps and that sort of thing that can help you along doing like short meditations, and you could build up from there. But that mindfulness piece is really helpful. Movement that is, in general, can help us to release stress. Any kind of movement that you enjoy. And there are some particular ones that can be even helpful for mind body. So, like yoga, for example. So those are some ideas on how we can manage our stress. But the more we manage our stress, the better periods we will have too. And of course, I can't not mention this connection to people is can help out with managing stress. The right people can help out with managing stress, and that could include having a mental health therapist to help you process and move through the stressors in your life. Last one is with our sleep. This is another foundational piece that we must have, we must take care of is our sleep. Making sure that we're getting enough sleep, but also like good quality sleep. So, ideally, we're getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep every single day. That is like that's the goal. And my goal for you is that sleep becomes a non-negotiable, that it's not something where you see it as a luxury or something like, oh, that's nice that someone is able to get that much sleep. But my goal is that you ultimately are able to get that and you're able to move your life around if you're not yet at that place, you're able to make adjustments to your life to where it is a non-negotiable. But regardless of how much sleep that you're getting, quality will be really important. So if maybe you are not quite getting that amount of sleep and that is something you've been working on to get up to the 7 to 9 hours, maybe you start working on your quality of sleep. So that could mean that you are sleeping in a room that is dark, having blackout curtains, maybe you have like tape or something like that, like on different lights that are emitting from your devices or whatever is in your space that you see a light from. Maybe you're putting tape on that. Maybe you are adding some a face mask so that if things are dark for you, if you feel comfortable doing that. Um, Also thinking about keeping the screen time, turning it off, cutting off screen time an hour before you go to bed, so that you're not getting that blue light in your eyes, which can then impact your melatonin production. And that melatonin production is important for you to fall asleep and stay asleep during the night. So we really want it to be producing properly. So yeah, the screen time, having blue light blocking glasses if you need to, have some sort of device a little bit closer to your bedtime. Maybe you're working late or whatever else is going on. At least have some blue light blocking glasses. Um, Having activities that are relaxing and restorative as you are winding down and going to bed. So this means maybe you're doing some stretches, or maybe that's when you do your journaling practice or your gratitude practice. Maybe you do a little bit of reading. Maybe you listen to music. Maybe you listen to a podcast that's like really uplifting and just like really calming and affirming for you. Whatever your practice is, but trying to like wind down and create an environment and space for yourself to where it signals to your body that, hey, it's time to rest. It's time to relax. And during sleep is when we are able to restore. So this is a major part. All right, so those are the three keys, the three secrets to having a painless period. So it's avoiding those inflammatory foods, having having anti-inflammatory habits, and then also prioritizing sleep and stress management. Those are the main keys. So if you're doing those things, you will be able to see a difference in your pain. And if you were looking for some more tips, I do have a guide, a free guide. It is called Easy Periods Naturally. So it goes over tips like this and more. There's a checklist in there so you can easily just check off and see what you're doing for the day and give you some guidance on the next steps for you as you are working towards having easy period and looking to having a pain-free period. So if you want to download that, you can go ahead. There's a link right below this video. And I will see you next time. Bye.